sociolinguistics and discourse analysis. Throughout my career, these have always been the fields on which I was most active as a player. And in fact, for me, they basically form one field. Let me just very quickly explain why and how. Sociolinguistics is, in my view, the study of the resources that people have in order to make meaning. So the communicative, not just linguistic, but the communicative resources that people have access to when they communicate. Now, communication, of course, is a very concrete thing. It's the production of discourse, right? And early on in my career, when I started studying, early forms of, let's say, conventional discourse analysis, in those days very strongly organized, textually, I very quickly I was unhappy about the way in which very often, for instance, in transcripts, I would see that recordings were heavily accented. For instance, in which you could hear that one of the speakers had a very strong, let's say, East African accent in English. That in the transcript, that accent basically disappeared. It was rendered in a sort of standard English or high dialect. All the features would be maintained, but most of what made that speaker identifiable as a speaker from East Africa was erased. Okay, and from that point onwards, his or her discourse would be analyzed, in a way that didn't really take into account the specific nature of the resources that he or she had access to, as if they didn't play a role in what happened, discursively between the interlocutors in the event. So here was my, let's say, dissatisfaction with conventional discourse analysis. It wasn't sociolinguistic enough. Now, I was happy early on in my career to find that I wasn't the only one who was worried about this particular problem or had this particular problem in mind. In 1982, John Gumperz published what became, of course, an absolute classic, a relatively small book called Discourse Strategies, all right, in which he argued exactly that. And so whenever we produce discourse and engage in interaction with other people, the resources by means of which we do this interaction, they matter. They're never neutral. They're never neutral, right? The access we have to particular forms of resources that are required in particular circumstances. And I think of, for instance, particular forms of literacy in administrative encounters, right, or bureaucratic environments, right? So having access to these specific resources may even effectively determine the outcome of what happens in the way of the discourse, all right? And even more extremely, particular forms of discourse will never be produced by you unless you have access to a number of specific resources. So you will be excluded from the world of productive discourse, so to speak, unless you have access to a number of specific resources. Simple example, illiterate people will never be the object of, let's say, textual analysis, because they don't produce them, right? They are absent from the field of literacy. As a consequence, we don't have data on these people, right? As if they don't exist. And so here, in my view, is the point. Whenever we want discourse analysis to be complete, to be comprehensive in its account of what happens in interaction, in real-time real life, real communication, we need to have a very, very, very keen awareness of the importance of the resources, the sociolinguistic material that is being used and deployed in the event, in the discourse, all right? And vice versa. When we do sociolinguistics, we want to see how these resources are deployed in life situations of interaction. So here for me is the way in which I always systematically and in a way inevitably merged sociolinguistics and discourse analysis. And I still very strongly believe that it's a compelling argument. No good analysis of discourse without having a look at the social linguistics of it, and no good social linguistics without having a look at the discursive aspects.